And I bet it smells heavenly. Before Delany and Le Guin, science fiction often defined utopia in terms of scientific progress, in the shape of things to come. H.G. Wells saw technology as our savior, our servant, and our techno-ticket to heaven. And in real life, machines and medicines have arguably made life safer, easier, and longer. Human life, anyway. I mean, without machines, I'd be dead up here. Actually, without machines, I'd still be safe down on Earth. In Brave New World, Aldous Huxley warns that the perfect plastic paradise will be a techno-trap that dehumanizes humans. But most SF writers say utopia simply isn't achievable. Authors such as John Brunner, Philip K. Dick, and Sherry Ann Lewitt fear that our quest for a high-tech heaven will produce a polluted, overpopulated hell. And chasing a heaven that turns out to be a hell is also a traditional theme in horror fiction. Clive Barker employed utopias in Weave World, Imagica, and recently in The Thief of Always, where a boy is promised a child's heaven of endless summer. Last month, Clive and I talked about why fantastic fiction is the perfect place for utopias.
I think fantastic writing is very often said, well, look, let's talk about the best possibilities and the worst. Let's talk about what life would be like if we were able to create this land of milk and honey. And let's also talk about what would happen if life became hell, or even worse hell than it already is. It's interesting to me that at a time when it seems our grasp of theological utopias, our grasp of hereafters is slipping more and more. We see, just by picking up the newspaper, in Europe, the rise of fascist forces talking about how they can make the state whole again in a way which last time led to the most monstrous calamity. It's almost as though we need somehow, whether it be in theological or sociological terms, to achieve some ideal, or at least dream of the perfect city-state, the perfect place, the perfect condition.
In James Morrow's City of Truth, the perfect city-state is Veritas. Truth reigns supreme. You drive a Plymouth Adequate, eat at the No Great Shakes restaurant, and read Beat Off magazine. Plato might like Veritas. The poets have been thrown out, and everything seems to be perfect. What does Jack learn about Utopia from his adventures at Veritas and then in the underground? Nancy, did I have hiccups that day, or what's going? Okay. Sorry, folks. Machinery. The narrator in City of Truth is Jack Sperry, who works at the Wittgenstein Museum, eliminating art. No more metaphor and hyperbole. A human heart can't soar like an eagle. But when Jack's son is diagnosed with a deadly disease, he needs the lie of hope. So he turns to an illegal underground movement who believes that pigs can fly, horses have 6 legs, and yes, incurable disorders can be cured. What does Jack learn about Utopia from his adventures in Veritas and then in the underground city Satirev?
I think that the message of City of Truth is that any attempt to organize a society from top to bottom and left to right, any attempt at the totalitarian dream is ipso facto wrong-headed, no matter how wonderful the ideals behind it might be. I think the protagonist learns that, not that there cannot be utopias, but that there should not be utopias. Neither of those worlds are where he wants to live. No. And he runs away from the very notion of engineering a society, and we don't know where he's going to end up, and he doesn't know where he's going to end up. But in this book, I'm saying utopia is a bad idea. In other books, I've said utopia is a good idea. I always like to make the sort of Ibsen move where, you know, as you may know, in one play, he would argue one side of the illusion versus reality question, and then in a subsequent play, he would come out on the other side. And in the case of my novel, Wine of Violence, I say utopia might be a good idea. Utopia could work. I suppose there it's a utopia that's so dear to my heart, the notion of universal pacifism, that I really wanted to give it its due and have the evil not be inherent, at least not within the ideal of pacifism. The evil is inherent in the vulnerability, I suppose, that utopia is eventually, the utopia in the Wine of Violence is breached by outside humanity, and it's also under siege continually by the neurovores.
Geoff, the society in the child garden seemed, well, nearly perfect. Were you consciously setting up a utopia?
Certainly in the child garden, what I was trying to do was trying to create a society that was neither a utopia or a dystopia. You couldn't tell. There were great things about the world. Everyone's educated. Everyone has all the languages and information they need to have. Nobody thieves. Your personality faults, you're given a highly effective dose of psychotherapy once you're old enough to have established personality faults, so you're much happier. There's not, in some ways, there's not a lot wrong with that world. On the other hand, it is hell for one particular person who's the heroine.
Why do so many utopias in fiction have a protagonist who's at odds with their society?
I think what fiction can do, what essays do and what political agendas do, is they set priorities by looking at broad mass. What happens to the broad mass of people? In general, what is the result in general of a particular policy? And I think what fiction does is to say, yeah, well, while you're being all general, don't forget him or her over there. That one person. And so it's the individual case in fiction. And that's where its emotional appeal comes from.
Iain, it must be difficult creating conflict for an action-adventure story when it's set in a utopian future. Is that why you chose a protagonist who opposes the culture in Consider Phlebas?
I was trying really hard not to sort of proselytize for it too much and say, hey, isn't this a great place, chaps? Isn't this a fabulous future? And I think I sort of might have gone, by choosing to take a central character who was actually working on the other side, as it were, and thoroughly hated the culture, that it might have started off on the wrong foot. Because a lot of people have said, but you actually like the culture? Is it actually, you think it's a pleasant place? It is. It's great. And once you start explaining it, I think people tend to accept it. But it's very difficult, if not for someone like me, impossible, to write a story within a utopia. Because, the basis of any sort of narrative art is conflict. Hence your question. And to get conflict in a utopia is actually quite difficult. I think the only person who's done it at all well is Stanley Robinson, who's, especially his last book, Pacific Edge, has done some really great stuff set in a utopia. I found that quite difficult because I quite enjoy writing action sequences, and violence and all that sort of stuff. There's not too much of that around, really, in a utopia. I suppose there might be in virtual reality, but that's another story. So I find I have to go to the outskirts, where the culture as a utopia is interfacing with not another civilization, whatever, to get places where I can set my stories. And in the first one, I thought, what was the antithesis of the culture? What would the culture really, really hate, and what would really, really hate the culture? Right. So a faith that was determined to expand and to push out and to control. I thought it would be the one thing that would actually annoy the culture enough. It would actually feel that it was threatened enough, in a sense. Its entire mission, its existence, in a way. Even though it wasn't actually directly threatened itself, the one thing that the culture could actually do that gave it a reason for existing, one unselfish thing it could do, was to go out and try and interfere constructively in other civilizations. And to find that your mission, if you like, being thwarted by a bunch of religious nutters, basically, was the one thing that might actually get them to go to war.